Now, let me start by saying that having spent my entire life living in New Mexico, a lot of people I know have claimed to have seen a skinwalker. They are kind of our regional boogeymen, but ask Navajo about them, and they will either absolutely ignore the question and all following, or they will kind of laugh it off, saying something to the effect of, well, white people believe they are myths. Well, here's my story regarding them. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington, New Mexico. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are just too much of a hassle for the larger delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo reservation, about 2 hours away from Farmington. My dad gets the call for the job while he is chilling with his Navajo friend, Travis, and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got family in Window Rock that he hasn't seen in ages and suggests that they go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was summertime, so Dad decides that we'll go down together. He can do his delivery really quick. Then, while Travis sees his family, we can go and check out Window Rock, which is a big rock face with a large hole in it that goes to the other side. We had to convoy in separate trucks since my dad's was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some walkie-talkies so we can communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock. Everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my dad and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of the Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. We're somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup, New Mexico. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the road was kinda slick, so we were taking it pretty slow. On the left of the highway, there is nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right, there is a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crest the top of this hill, and down at the bottom of the hill, we see what appears to be a very large dog sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio, "Hey Trav, do you see that big-ass dog?" Travis starts yelling back over the radio, "That's not a dog. Speed up right now and hit it." He sounds almost hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it! You have to hit it, please!" So my dad starts to speed up, and as we get a bit closer, I begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appears to have dried blood all over it. It's still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and looks at us, and it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than a mix between a bear's and a human's face. It looks twisted, distorted, and almost in pain. As we get closer to this thing, we start to realize it's actually huge, though it was still sitting on its haunches. It is about shoulder height with the hood of the truck. We literally get inches away from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like somebody screaming as their lungs were filling with water, and it leaps backwards towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then with another leap, it was gone from sight. Travis comes over the radio again. "Keep driving, we have to get out of here, go faster." He kept repeating the last part. "We have to get out of here, we have to go faster." Pretty soon, we were speeding like crazy, and just as we start to come over near the outskirts of Gallup, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us. Naturally, this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge and immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull over as well. Travis says, "We just saw a skinwalker a few miles back and it's been following us." The officer immediately turns white, stammers something about a verbal warning, gets in his car and takes off. We do the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. So, first off, this is my friend's story, an experience out camping by himself in the Arizona wilderness. I will try to retell his story the best I can. I will write in his perspective of the story. I went hiking out in the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to the campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along with my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes or snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down, so I went to bed at 18:30, messed around on my phone for about an hour, then passed out. Was woken up again by a call from a mutual friend around 20:30, and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I could not move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling earlier, so I knew that's what these were. I was sleeping with my back to the wall of the tent, and one of the little things pressed his nose into my back and sniffed for a good 3 minutes. I had sleep paralysis again, and I couldn't even grab my rifle to shoot it. The second thing happened a few hours later, at 0300 something. This was a nightmare, not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up and peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and a child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, not more than 6 feet away. I asked them who they were. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave this place." They made each a horrifying face, and I was able to grab my rifle. I tried to shoot at them because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, but the trigger wouldn't budge. She and the child stood at once and walked away into the shrub trees behind my tent. The woman walked on until I couldn't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because there was moonlight falling on the other side of the tree, I could watch her silhouette change shape. She became a gangly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all I was worth, and then she collided with my tent. In that instant, I actually woke up screaming and throwing a wild punch into the wall. I was sitting up. As for my friend, of course, something also followed him on the way back to his car. He had scratches all over his arm when he took off his sweater, and he never went through any brush. I don't know if it's Skinwalker territory or if he was in a haunted area. He said he's never hiking in that spot again and plans to take somebody with him next time. I am in high school, and it's an okay school, as it's not very well known, as it is kind of for the middle class kids. The school has 7 classes in one day, and the teacher who told me his story is my second class of the day. So, for the rest of the day, I was thinking about it, but anyway, this is his story. It was the middle of the night, and he was driving through the Arizona desert, with it being pitch black outside. In a deserted road, he was driving a little above the speed limit when he hit what he thought was a dog. He got out to check it out and found some weird thick hair all over his bender, but no dent or animal in view. He was confused. Then he saw some blood on the ground and got his flashlight out from his car to follow the blood. Following the blood trail to a weird little stream, he was looking around for the dog when his light ran over the dog. The dog was revealed by his flashlight to be a humanoid figure hunched over looking at him. He flipped out and ran away and got back into his car, about to floor it, when he looked into the rearview mirror. The figure was sitting in his back seat, in the middle, smack dab in view of the rearview mirror. My teacher flips out even more and runs out of the car somewhere in the middle of the Arizona desert. Later, he went to a Navajo tribe as he told some locals what had happened, and they convinced him to go see the Navajo tribe. And they told him how he experienced a skinwalker and that he was marked for life by his encounter. To start with, I am a white female. I was adopted 7 years ago by a Navajo family, and we've always been close despite obvious cultural differences. Still, I learned about skinwalkers firsthand, and they've since become an accepted part of my life. I left Utah at the end of 2012 and was surprised to see the general enthusiasm for Skinwalker stories. I have a ton of them, but I will start off with a few and see if people want to hear more. The first happened to my adopted uncle. He was driving through the canyon area. They live in Blanding, Utah, a spot not quite notorious for skinwalkers, but full of them nonetheless. At night, it got that eerie, familiar feeling. It was dark outside, but the moon illuminated the canyon and brush enough for him to see out of his side vision that something was running across the desert night. He was in his 40s at the time and a police officer, so a full-grown man. He started singing and praying in Navajo and kept his eyes on the road in front of him. But he was driving at least 60 miles an hour, so the shape running through the desert was keeping pace with him despite his high speed. He said that it looked vaguely human-shaped, but paler than any human he'd ever seen. Still, he didn't look directly at it, and despite his singing, he was getting more and more scared. One thing my Navajo family always taught me was that these creatures feed on your fear. This one certainly seemed to. My uncle was shaking and sweating when the running thing picked up speed, outpacing his truck. And then when it was maybe 30 yards ahead of him, it made a sharp right turn and began to run toward the road. He knew it was going to directly intersect with him, and he made up his mind to put his foot on the gas because being braked out in the middle of the road in the dark alone was a death sentence. So it got closer, he sped up, and just as the two crossed paths, it jumped onto the road. So he saw it for the first time. He described it as a skinny man in jeans and a plaid shirt, with a long face and big yellow eyes that looked like cat eyes. Its arms were thrown up over its head, and its hands were kind of flying out behind it. The worst part was that its mouth was open and seemed to be disconnected from its jaw. Its chin was just flopping around about a foot below its nose. It leapt onto the road and then just as quickly jumped out of the way of his truck, and he didn't see it again. He prayed the whole way home, and they had a ceremony shortly after that. Another encounter happened to my adopted brother, who is one of the most level-headed and unshakable men I've ever met. He was 30 when this happened. He was at their dad's house, partaking in one of the ceremonies, which happens in a hogan. The rule is that you never leave the hogan alone because the magic and the energy that you make during those ceremonies is kind of like a supernatural light beacon, and you never know what kind of creatures you are attracting. Still, Eric, my brother, was a pretty rational guy and wasn't afraid of the dark. He'd been in the hogan for hours, chanting and praying and all that good stuff, and he needed a smoke break and to take a leak. So against the general rule, he edged out of the roundhouse and out into the night. There was nothing around except 15 or 20 parked cars, all close to the ceremony area. It was a large gathering. So, Eric did his business with no incident and lit up a cigarette. He was standing there, staring off into space, when he got that feeling of being watched. To shake it off, he walked away from the hogan, about 20 feet, and scanned the desert. Everything was quiet, except the drums coming from the tent and the singing. Just as he was about to shrug his weird feeling and chuck his cigarette butt, he saw it. Under one of the vehicles, a dark shape and two shining eyes. The eyes were like animal eyes. They didn't glow on their own, but they had reflective light in them, and they glinted right at Eric. They were yellow. The creature didn't have the shape of any animal he recognized. He explained it to me that it was shaped like Gollum, really skinny with a round head. Eric, not scared of something that would make me shit my pants instantly, walked toward the vehicle and bent down to get a closer look. Dust scrabbled around, and he could hear a skittering noise. One bony arm shoved some gravel his way, and the next thing he knew, the creature was gone and the vehicle was empty. But then he smelled this disgusting, puke-worthy stench, and he got scared then, because that's one of the worst things in Navajo culture. Bad smells are treated very seriously. Well, when they're assumed to be supernatural, of course. So he straightened back up and then realized the source of the smell. A shadow fell over him, covering him from behind. And he's around 6'2". So this thing, he said, he estimated at around 7.5 feet, at least. He was shivering and didn't move as it approached him from behind, until it was standing inches away. He could feel it, smell it, see its shadow, and then the worst thing. He felt it breathe on his neck. Eric said that it sounded like a horse or a cow when it snorts, and its breath was warm. When he looked at his feet, he saw his own shoes, and behind his right foot, a big hoof. So he closed his eyes and started to sing, and right at that moment, his dad and uncle got a terrible feeling from the inside Hogan. They bolted up and exited, calling his name. They found him shivering outside, too terrified to talk, and too terrified to stop singing in Navajo. It took Eric months before he shared this with us, and he did so expecting us to laugh or call him crazy. But I completely believe his story. I was driving with a friend out in the high desert in California, out near Victor Valley. I have driven this road before many times. It is mostly some shrubs and small desert trees, but in places it is kind of woody with large rocky areas. It was in one of these weird patches that we saw whatever it was. It was dusk. We were sober. The driver and I both caught about a 3-second glimpse of it between a few trees and a boulder. It looked like some sort of weird long humanoid with shiny skin and backwards knees. They bent the wrong way entirely. It was fast. We saw it again in another gap, and it seemed to be keeping up with the car. We got the hell off the road at the next bend near the place we were staying, locked the door, and talked about it for 10 minutes before deciding we were not crazy and also moving. Any ideas? Every year, my cousins and I go to our grandparents' small farm out in the middle of nowhere. And for the past 3 years, we've been trying to sleep outside in a little cardboard teepee-like thing. Every time, someone just came back inside because they were too scared to sleep there. About a week ago, we went back for our little annual visit. This was the only time we gathered the courage to go outside. I charged my phone up and stayed awake until about midnight-ish, when I had to pee. Before I went out, I looked outside and saw this weird thing with almost turquoise eyes and was kind of hunched over. I remember hearing something about this from a story on Reddit, but I couldn't remember the name. It was probably around 5 to 7 feet tall, and it just looked inside of our little teepee and stood there for a minute. I remembered that you shouldn't be seen by it, so I ducked down, and when I woke up in the morning, nothing was there. I just found out the name a few minutes ago, so I thought I'd share my story. Something strange about this is skinwalkers are mostly related to the Navajo, but my family and I are not a part of that whole thing. So, about an hour and 30 minutes ago, I was driving home from work through a local Navajo reservation. It's not the shortest way home, but I like the scenery, and I know a few of them personally, so it's a route that I like to take. And I saw something on the side of the road about 5 minutes outside of it. It looked like a big coyote, but something didn't feel right about it, if that makes any sense. I pulled over and looked through my window at it. It didn't move. It just sat there, on all fours, since it was sitting down looking up. I turned my brights on, and it snapped its head to me. I saw that its snout was shorter than a normal coyote's, and its eyes were glowing a dull sort of gold. It looked to be covered in a coarse type of fur that didn't seem to fit coyotes. I naturally got a bit freaked out at this point, and decided to nope on out of there. As I flipped my lights back on and started to accelerate, it stood up on 2 legs and just watched me go away. I swear that I saw its head go from canine to humanoid, but That's a bit of a stretch, I understand. I was already freaked out. My question is, has anyone ever seen skinwalkers? Does anyone know what they really are? Should I be concerned? Basically, just tell me all you can about skinwalkers. So, I have 2 stories to share with you. The first is I was out camping with 2 of my buddies who I'd grown up with in a long stretch of the forest north of New York. There were so many rumors of an old haunted house where people disappeared or something like that. We would go to the forest all the time to test our mettle, like the dumb kids we were. This one time, we were camping down by the river with a fire going, trying to scare each other. We kept telling each other scary stories until one of us passed out around midnight. Throughout the night, though, I felt like I was being watched but dismissed it as nerves. Around 1 in the morning, I got up to go pee before heading to sleep. I am a very private person, so I went to the forest. Not so far that I couldn't see the light of the fire, but far enough away that I couldn't see beyond the bushes. I did my business and was about to head back before I heard my friend say my name to my right. I thought he was just messing with me, so I shouted back for him to get back to the tents. But he kept beckoning me towards him, away from the camp, which I thought was odd. That's when I noticed the deer in the direction of my friend's voice. It took a moment for me to recognize what I was seeing, but when I did, my eyes widened with fear. The deer wasn't a deer. I knew because it was standing on 2 legs. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My mouth was wide open, but the scream couldn't come out. It was only when the thing, whatever it was, took a step towards me and said, "Come here, I have something to show you," in the voice of my friend. I ran back to the camp to find neither of my friends where they were supposed to be. I looked around and saw my hunting rifle next to where I was sitting and went for it. That's when I noticed the thing had followed me after it stepped out of the forest into the light. I fired a few shots at this thing, but it didn't seem to do anything, and I knew I hit my mark. I was pretty good. It stepped forward and I stepped back. I remember I tripped on the log I was sitting on, and as I did, it lunged for me. Next thing I remember, I'm waking up in the hospital with 3 gashes on my chest. Apparently, my 2 friends had found me in the woods after I had wandered off. They spent 3 days looking for me, only to find me back in the camp injured. To this day, none of us know what happened or if it even did. I just wish I could forget about it, but it has haunted me ever since. The second story I have is my dad owned a cabin out in the woods in West Virginia, and it was tradition that he would take me and my brother there hunting every spring. By all accounts, I enjoyed spending time with my father. He was busy most of the year with business, so these hunting trips were the only real time me and my brother got to spend with him. I was 15 when this happened. We were staying at the cabin for around a week. For the first 3 days, we had a few decent catches, hares and the like, but we were finding it difficult to find any deer. This was odd as deer are usually everywhere. At night, we were hearing strange noises like animal calls at night or scratches on the door, but we just assumed there was some strange animal about. On the 4th night, we didn't hear anything. I was fast asleep when my brother woke me up by screaming. I told him to shut up before realizing why he was screaming. There was a strange figure standing over his bed. It just stood there saying, "It's okay," over and over in my dad's voice. Just then, my dad came into the room with his shotgun and shot at whatever it was. It didn't seem to like that and screamed back at him and ran off. My dad didn't waste time and dragged me and my brother out to the car and drove us the 218 miles back home. He later told me that the thing around our room was a skinwalker. He sold the cabin, and we have never been back since. I'm 18 now, but I believe it was when I was 15 when this happened. For context, I live on a native reserve in Canada. I'm not Navajo, but I've seen these stories online and realized what I saw was a skinwalker. It was winter and storming, and I was home alone. The power went out, and my mom, brother, sister, and sister-in-law called me to say that they will continue to drive around since they don't want to sit with no power. I don't mind, because I still had data and just texted my friends. After a while, I hear knocking near the stairs or boots going up or down. I tried to justify this as my golden retriever's tail hitting the wall, but it was far-fetched. It continued and continued, then wasn't in a singular place anymore. I called my mother, asking her to come get me. Around 5 minutes later, my brother opened the door and shouted, "We're waiting in the truck." I run to the front door and struggle to put my boots on. Also, for context, my house is a split house, with the front door opening to the stairs going up and down. I was able to see up the stairs and down to an extent because of the headlights and moonlight combined. I got a gross feeling and looked downstairs to see this very long-limbed, gray-white creature crawling on all fours from one side of the basement to the other, in a bedroom. It didn't have a face, no clothes, bony, around 5 foot tall, on all fours, and looked like a human trying to run like a dog. I've been scared of this ever since and haven't seen it again. I realized skinwalkers was a thing, so I don't know what any of this means. Do I even have a skinwalker sighting in my house or something? I'm not quite sure. I saw this strange animal back in June of 2012. Was helping my brother move out of his place just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. We were making several trips to and from his new place, dropping stuff off and going back for more loads, and we were on the final trip to his new place. We had been moving all day, and it was roughly 11 p.m. at night. And the moving truck with me was just me and my brother, who was next to me. Where he lived was a longer, desolate road, and as we're going down this road, this animal climbs out from the brush on the side of the road onto the road, looks over at us, and clears the whole road in just a single bound. This thing looked like a shaggy, huge German shepherd with a wolf-like head. I don't remember the eyes at all, but it did bare its teeth at us. We pulled up on the road far enough that we had time to slow down to observe what it was. I just remember seeing so many sharp teeth in its mouth. It's like it had too many teeth. My brother and I were scared shitless, even long after it jumped off the road. Of course, he was only another 15 or so minutes down the road to where his new place was, so he was already second-guessing his decision on moving out here. He's still there to this day and hasn't mentioned seeing anything like what we saw that night again. We don't really talk about it though, to be honest. To this day, I don't have an explanation, but I'm glad I wasn't alone in the experience, or I'd think I was just totally insane. I was camping in northern Ontario along the banks of a beautiful lake. There was a dock that spanned about 20 feet over the water surface, and the perimeter was full of brush and forest. My best friend and I were the only two humans present, stargazing and talking about everything and nothing. What happened next is burned into my memory, but in the midst of our conversation, there was a deafening crack. We both turned our attention behind us and out stepped the most realistic-looking werewolf I've ever seen in my life. This thing had to have been easily 9 feet tall, hulking muscles, and a giant head. I immediately thought of the werewolf from the Van Helsing movie and damn near soiled my pants. This thing looked at me first, and I for a moment, and then stepped off into the woods as if nothing had happened. This animal had the most piercing yellow eyes I have ever seen out in nature. My friend and I were not only fear-stricken, but were stiffened by the shock of what we had just experienced. Slowly, I turned to my best friend as if to silently confirm that she had just seen the same thing that I did. The look on her face said it all. We both quietly retreated into our tent without speaking about what we saw until daylight the following day. I don't know if what we witnessed was some kind of animal or what, or if it was a different kind of otherworldly creature. Me and my cousin avoided a terrible accident 5 years ago when a large, unknown animal ran across the road and almost caused us to wipe out. I was riding on the back of my cousin's motorcycle with him down the highway. It was nighttime, and there wasn't much traffic out on the road. We came to a part of the highway where it goes up a hill and then starts to descend slowly. You can't see over this hill since it's quite long. Once we got to the top and started our descent, this huge gray animal bolts out of the woods to our right and sprints so fast across the road in just a few strides. My cousin started to turn the motorcycle, but this thing was already gone. Had this animal come out just a second later, we would have collided. It happened so very fast, but I caught a glimpse of it with the headlight hitting this thing. It looked like a giant gray wolf from what I saw, except its back was haunched all weird. I could only really make out the head somewhat because it just flew by us so fast. My cousin and I don't really talk about it because we kind of just brushed it off and continued on with our trip. I remember for the night though, my cousin was psyched about what we saw, telling me he didn't think dogs got that big out in the wild. This was almost 2 years ago, when I was 16 and didn't think much of it. But I was reminded of it today, and it gave me the chills. At the time, I lived with my dad 25 minutes out of town up on a higher mountain road, surrounded by lots and lots of woods, and a few neighbors scattered throughout. I went to sleep one night normally, only to wake up, but I woke up in a terrified state. My skin was covered in sweat and clammy, and I felt more on edge than I've ever felt before. I turned my head around to look out the window, since I do sleep next to a window, and see an all black but very well defined upright dog walking towards my front door, and I get this crushing feeling that it's going to attack me. This thing was pitch black and just a giant shape. I remember jumping out of my bed and running to my room door, which was open, and getting to the front door to make sure it was locked. I quickly scrambled to make sure all my curtains and windows were tightly locked. I waited quietly, but didn't hear anything. That was the first time that happened to me, and I had never experienced anything like that prior to this first event. Another experience I had is a two-parter somewhat. One night, I remember seeing red eyes staring back at me through my front window. These eyes were a good distance apart, high up in the air, heck, I'd even say 7 feet or more, and tucked away in the blackness beyond the light of my porch light. I screamed and ran to close my curtains and hide in my room for the rest of the night. Few nights later, I get another sensation again that wakes me up, like there's an evil presence outside my bedroom window. At this point, the curtains are closed entirely, and the window is for sure locked. I feel a paralyzing sense of dread and fear. After what felt like forever, I began to hear a scratching against the window. It sounded like a dog trying to claw on the glass. You know how when dogs paw on the glass repeatedly? It was like that. I honestly thought I was having vivid hallucinations until I realized what I was experiencing was real. At some point, I remember my room lighting up because something huge was standing in my window, blocking in all light from the moon. I didn't realize how dark my room had gotten, and once this figure moved from outside my window, the moonlight shone through better. These types of experiences has never happened to me again, and I'm really curious as to why I had them happen, around the same time, of course. I would say I had these in the span of maybe a month or two. I don't believe in monsters or anything like that, but whether it be a demon or something unexplained like an animal, I'll never be quite sure. My uncle had his encounter in the summer several years back. Only reason I believe him is because his whole life, he's always been a very super serious, no bullshit kind of guy. When he told the story, he sounded genuinely upset about it. He is a long-haul truck driver and was stopped on the side of a highway in a heavily wooded area. This was somewhere several miles in the middle of nowhere, but he said it was closest to Reed City. I can't recall what he said he was doing, but he had to fix something before he could just take off. Also, he didn't have a trailer on at the time. He had just gotten done fixing up his stuff and was about to climb into his truck when he saw a deer come towards him from the tree line. He said it looked like it might have been running from something. He assumed it might have been a bear. He was just getting ready to leave when he suddenly sees something looking at him through the passenger side window. He described it as having jet black fur and bright yellow eyes, as well as vicious-looking, snarling teeth. It was so close to him that he could see its fur blowing with the slight breeze that was coming through. The window was open, but it didn't seem to notice, as was evident when the creature put its paw up to the window, as if to press it against the window, but pulled it back in shock when it realized its paw actually entered the vehicle. My uncle typically carries a gun on him, and at this time, he had a heavy revolver. The exact name and caliber is beyond my memory. He pointed it at the dogman and pulled the trigger, effectively shooting it directly in the face. Finally, the truck started moving fast enough for him to be confident that the thing wasn't following him, should it have survived the shot. He didn't bother waiting around to find out. He said he still gets disturbed when he thinks back to that event. He described it as giving off this aura of pure evil and ill intent, in only the few seconds that he faced it. He has nightmares about this creature to this day, and he has refused to tell anyone about it until several years after it happened, for fear of people thinking he had lost his mind. Another reason I'm able to buy his story is because he has never been interested in the occult, supernatural, paranormal cryptids, etc. He had no idea what to make of this thing, but when he told me the story, I told him to look into the whole DOGMAN phenomenon. When he looked online, he said the artist's depictions of the DOGMAN perfectly for what he saw that day. My roommate, a guy we'll call Jim, spent his high school years in a little town in eastern Wyoming. I can't recall the name of the town, but it was the kind of place that most people had forgotten about, since the trains had stopped coming through. It was a very weird little town, and most of the people living there seemed to be very paranoid. A lot of parents would not let their children play outside after dark, and all unfamiliar faces were regarded with suspicion. Since the town was miles away from the nearest McDonald's or movie theater or shopping mall, there was nothing for young people to do but get shit-faced drunk. That's what Jim and his friends were planning to do on the night that this encounter takes place. A fellow classmate was having a kegger at his parents' house that night, which was 20 miles out of town on a dirt road somewhere. Jim had reservations about driving out there in the dark, because that general area was known to be sort of creepy at night. But his friends really wanted to go, and he was the only one with a car. So, after some coaxing, Jim and about 5 of his friends pile into his Buick and head out of town. About an hour and a half later, they realize that they are completely lost. They can't find the road that they are supposed to turn on, and it's too dark to read any of the signs. They haven't seen any houses or cars for a while, so they figure they must have taken a wrong turn somewhere and decide to head back to the main road. After turning the car around and driving in the opposite direction for a few miles, Jim spots something in the middle of the road up ahead. His friend in the passenger seat notices it at the same exact time he does and said, "What the hell is that, dude?" At first, they can't tell what they're looking at, but as the car draws near to the big black shape in the middle of the road, it starts to look like a mass of fur. Jim thinks it must be an animal, but it looks big enough to do damage to his car, so he slows down and stops the car about 20 feet away from the thing. At this point, it is completely illuminated by his headlights, but neither he nor his passengers can figure out what the hell kind of animal it might be. Since it hasn't moved, They assume it must be dead and start to argue over who will drag it over to the side of the road. That's when the thing starts to move. They all fall silent and watch as it stirs and then suddenly stands up. Jim would always preface the next part of the story with, "I know this sounds crazy, but..." He says he can't really describe what he saw because he had never seen anything like it before. The closest he can come is this. The thing, whatever it was about 7 feet tall when it rose to its full height. Its body was shaped like a human male, but it was covered with a thick, dark fur. The head, he said, and I watched the goosebumps break out on his arms as he said it was not human. It looked almost like a jackal or a German shepherd with a long snout and pointed ears, and its eyes were glowing in the headlights the way a cat's does sometimes. It was staring right at them. Jim doesn't know how long he stared back at the thing before he noticed that it was clutching a dead rabbit in one of its enormous hands. He had barely any time to register this bit of information when the creature suddenly flung the dead rabbit away and took a step towards the teenagers in the car. Everybody screamed and Jim slammed the car into reverse, made a U-turn, and got the hell out of there. Needless to say, they didn't make it to the party that night. This was right about a year ago. A few details out of the way first. I was living on 44 acres of mountain land. There are several buildings on the property, but the main two are currently my parents' house and their guest house. They are only 20 feet apart, or about the distance of a single-lane grave road. It was in my parents' house, cooking something. My house was the guest house since it doesn't have a kitchen or anything, so I used my parents' house for cooking and showering. No one but myself was living on the property at the time. Okay, to the story. I was cooking. I heard the house shake. I'm not sure how to otherwise explain it, but it sounded like the corner of the house shook, kind of like a dog had just shook it right after getting out of the water. Well, coincidentally, there is a creek right next to my house. So I walk into the living room from the kitchen on my way to the front door to check what's going on. I don't see anything. I looked outside and didn't hear anything moving. I was about to close the door and the cat comes in. Strange, I thought, but at the same time it didn't faze me too much. It's a cat. They come in at all hours of the night. Well, sooner than later, my food was done and I wanted to go back to my house so I could watch TV. As I was walking across the road, I noticed a figure off to my left, so I turned to look at it, and there stands this 5 foot tall. The ears on this thing stood straight up and were about shoulder height on me, and I'm 5'11". It was essentially a German shepherd, from what I could tell, standing regular like a dog would, but its eyes glowed red. It was a complete silhouette of the animal, so I didn't see any features, but it definitely had the build of a German shepherd. It didn't move. It just stared directly at me, 10 feet away. I darted into my house to grab my shotgun, and I came back outside to find it was gone. No sound, no signs of movement, just gone. I fired off a couple of rounds in case it was still around somewhere, but it was gone. My parents want me to believe it was just a coyote. Coyotes aren't built that beefy. This thing was huge and buff, like pit bull breed to kill buff, and Great Dane tall. Most accurate description of the animal I can give you. Glowing red eyes, vertical pointed ears, thick head, round like a pit bull, but German shepherd shape, thick body. I couldn't see anything below the chest. I was just too focused on its eyes. But it did look like it had legs and was standing on the ground. It was also unnaturally still. Hello all. I had an experience to me when I was around 12-13 that I had forgotten about until it recently came up in conversation with family. It's about a creature I saw at my grandparents' property. To set the landscape, my grandparents live on an 8-acre plot of rectangular land that is gradually sloping upward the whole way. The top half is entirely woods, with the house sitting just below the tree line, giving a pretty good view to the rest of the property below. About 300 yards from the house is an old shed with a creek behind it. The shed sits near a fence/property line, and on the other side is a farm that used to be much bigger, but at the time only had 4 to 5 cows roaming around. So I was sitting on a swing on my grandparents' porch, alone, just relaxing and looking at the fields below. Off to my left, towards the shed, I noticed this gray-white animal with black spots here and there, walking on all 4 legs. Immediately, I thought it was one of the cows, as they were known to sometimes cross the fence into the yard. I got up to go tell my grandfather. When I looked back to watch where the cow was walking to, it then walked to the shed, raised itself off its front legs only onto its back legs, and just leaned on the shed. I thought it was odd until it turned its head in my direction. Even with the distance between us, I got immediate chills and this overpowering feeling that I just knew it somehow was staring right at me. I turned around and ran into the house, told my grandfather, and came back outside. It was no more than 1 minute from the time I left to was back outside, and it was gone. No trace of it, and no cows anywhere near the fence. I told my grandfather what I saw it do, and he chuckled, told me that's a nice imagination, and was the end of it. It terrified me so much of the time that I tried to put it out of my mind, but I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. Does this sound familiar to anyone? In March 2015, I woke up at around 3 in the morning. I have no idea why. Usually I wake up to drink water or use the bathroom, but I needed neither of those things. Anyway, I was living in Southern California at the time, near Camp Pendleton, and where I lived there was my neighborhood, then just wilderness. There was nothing beyond my neighborhood for miles, just land. Just an FYI, I have always been into the supernatural, but I don't think I really believed it until this experience. Before I went to sleep, I opened my window because it was hot, and I had my curtains open and my shades open, and I pulled them up to make sure air was able to get in. So at 3 a.m., I woke up and just looked out my window, which was next to my bed, and I thought I saw somebody standing at the crosswalk across the street. I was just thinking, that's so weird, because usually we didn't have runners or early morning wakers until about 5. So I got up and went to my window so I could get a closer look at what I saw. But I will never forget what I saw. This thing was standing, but its legs were bent, and it had some white fur covering the body. However, I could still see some skin. Its back was hunched over, and its face looked like some sort of dog's. If this creature was standing straight up, I'd say that it would be about 7 or 8 feet tall. Now, mind you, this was at 3 a.m., so I was just like, wow, okay, you're hallucinating. Go back to sleep. However, I was literally paralyzed and could not take my eyes off of this creature. Its nose and ears just looked so similar to a dog's or some sort of wolf or coyote. Where I lived, coyotes were very prevalent. However, they never ever really came into the neighborhood. And for anyone that says it could have been a bear, there are no bears in the area that I lived in because it was such a warm, desert-like climate. So as you can tell, I was just completely shocked and nervous, and I was able to shut my window. The thing turned its head and stared right at me. It was standing directly under a streetlight, so I could see its features pretty clearly, and its eyes were just so black. But somehow they were shining to where you could really see them staring right into your soul. That did it for me. I slammed my window shut, pulled down the blinds, closed the curtains, and jumped right into bed while pulling the covers over my face. I never went back to sleep that night. Flash forward 2 years later, in June of 2017, I again woke up, but this time I was just hungry. So I went downstairs to get some food and sat at my kitchen table. In the chair that I sat, my back was facing the window on the side of the house. This window was about a foot off the ground, and it was open about 10 inches because my mom forgot to shut it. Now, that window had no screen because it got torn somehow, and we just didn't get around to replacing it yet. Anyway, I had my earbuds in and was watching a movie or show. I can't exactly remember, but I heard a noise. I couldn't tell if it was from the movie or from outside, so I paused and listened. I then heard heavy breathing, but I have never heard this kind of breathing before, and it was coming directly behind me, right outside the window. The breathing was rough, rigid, and sounded anything other than a human. I was too scared to turn around and face it, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I had goosebumps everywhere. The breathing lasted for about 2 minutes. Then I heard heavy footsteps, as if this thing was walking away. After about 10 minutes had passed, I shut the window, locked it, closed the curtains, and ran up to my room. I told my parents about my first encounter the next day after it happened. I was 16 at the time and still living with Mom and Dad. They just kind of looked at me and laughed and said I was seeing things and that it was probably just a coyote. After my second encounter, I told them the next day, and that time they really thought I was just tired and was hearing things. My question to everybody out there is, have any of you experienced something similar to this? Was this just a coyote, or do you guys think I was hallucinating? It's been really bothering me for a while now, and I've been really wanting to get my story out there because I cannot deal with no answers. This took place in the summer of 2004, around July, in the Bristol Bay County. I am a commercial fisherman in Alaska and have been doing so since 1970. I'm an avid outdoorsman, hunter, and someone who just loves to get out there. Every year after fishing, I try to take a trip upriver with a friend or two to wind down and enjoy ourselves before we go home. This year, while I was on this trip into Alaska's interior, our main mission was to take pictures of bears and the surrounding wildlife to promote a new bear viewing and sports fishing business. While on our 5-day trip, we spotted more than 40 bears. I took hundreds of pictures of these bears and their tracks. One of which was so big, it put chills up my spine and gave me and my companions a very uneasy sense of insecurity. What set this track apart from the others was its enormous size and human-like shape. In one of the pictures that I took of this track, I placed my foot next to it on the ground. Keep in mind, I'm wearing a size 13 boot. Whatever made this track was so heavy, heavier than the biggest bear, that it pushed the gravel so far into the earth that it made us truly speculate what we were looking at. Other pictures that we took of the bear tracks were nowhere close to that indentation that this track had left. One of the most intriguing things about this track, where there were no visible claw marks, is with all the other bear tracks. Both of us felt extremely uneasy of our surroundings and had the feeling that we were being watched. For the rest of the day, we didn't have much to talk about, and that night felt uncomfortable at camp. We never heard or smelled anything out of the ordinary. To this day, I am not really sure what we saw, and I'm not making any claims other than the words I have put forth. I've only heard of one other story, from an old native man that lived by himself, a true hermit. He spoke of a tall creature that walked on 2 legs, and watched him for 30 minutes from across the river, which his cabin overlooked approximately 200 feet away. When first sighted, he was motionless, staring straight at him. Then this creature, which he named Hairy Man, turned and briskly walked away. My hiking partner and I arrived to the Kennecott area. We were trying to make it to the campsites near the glacier, but it started to get too dark, even for us. So, we decided to camp at the first available site. We found a small spot right off the trail, so we made camp and hung our supplies in a tree down the trail. Started a fire, and were just finishing a small meal when I walked to the trail to smoke. I was standing on a trail a few minutes when I noticed what I thought was a man on the bike coming down the trail. I let my partner know, but when I looked back, it was still in the same spot. I started looking more closely to see a face or the bike or something. It was then I realized it was not a person. It was a large dark form, legs spread apart. This is what led me to think it was a person on a bike. The arms were curled at its side like someone with hands on handlebars. Too big for a bear, and the legs were too far apart. I called my partner, but when turned back to look at it again, it moved very quickly into the woods on two legs. The next day we looked but found no evidence of anything on the trail. I've told this story to a few people, but they all think I'm crazy. I hope this helps. I know what I saw. I guess I'm just hoping somebody believes me. My hunting buddy and I were sitting on a ridge, watching for caribou. About 1,000 yards away, and a large clearing was in view. While we were glassing the clearing for caribou to come out of the brush, we watched a large gray animal walking on hind legs walk between two large spruce trees on opposite sides of the clearing. We were both longtime Alaskans, avid hunters, and have logged many, many hunts in North America. I have hunted all of the North America's deer, elk, black, and grizzly bear. I have never seen an animal like what we saw that day. We watched it for over half an hour move from one tree across the clearing to the other tree. Eventually, caribou moved into the area, and we lost sight of the animal when it moved off into heavy, thick brush. We had never heard of a Bigfoot in Alaska, but we did tell the bush pilot that picked us up from our hunt that we had seen something strange. He told us we had probably seen the hairy man, a well-known animal of the region by the native people. Me and a couple of friends had been bored one December when I decided we should take a walk through the woods behind my house. I didn't think much of it, as me and my friend have done it many times before. There were 4 of us, and we set out about 11 o'clock at night. It was rather dark, but there was light from the moon. The weather was rather cold, as we did this in the winter. The area we walked on was game trails that moose normally walk on, as well as trails used for mushers, runners, cross-country skiers, and that sort. We had walked about 2 miles from my house to another entrance where most people enter. On the way, we had talked about unexplainable events, or things such as Bigfoot or UFOs. When we reached the bridge where most people come in, one friend had smoked a cigarette. We then saw a light and decided to go on. On the way back, we heard a wild dog barking wildly and decided to pick up the speed. It eventually became a sprint whereafter we walked. When we walked, we continued talking about it. It was then I realized something had been following us, as well as testing us, or even harassing us. It was much earlier, I just didn't think about it. I thought it was my friend Warren, who is sometimes clumsy. I had thought it was him who had made noises such as slipping, but it was really something throwing something at us. I had realized this was about halfway back. I asked if Warren kept slipping, when he told me it wasn't, and he thought I could have been pulling a prank on him. We stopped for a minute to listen, when I told the others something strange was going on. We stopped and shone a flashlight around, hearing noises such as steps and branches moving and breaking. The leader had thought I had been playing a joke when I told him seriously I wasn't. He decided to walk behind with me, when something threw snowballs and nearly hit us on many occasions. It was then he realized that this was no joke, and we picked up a light jog for most of the way. When we were almost out of the woods, we heard dogs again, maybe 20 feet away. The branches breaking, and again, something throwing stuff at us. By the time we left, it was about 3 to 3:30 in the morning. I did not go directly to my house because I didn't know if it was still following us. I knew this was not a prank because the snow is more than 5 feet deep in the woods, and someone would have had an extremely hard time to play a prank like that. This was in February of 2004, up near Powerline Clearings east of Potter Marsh out of Anchorage. I and 2 of my friends were bored one night, so we decided to do a little snow machining. Thought it was illegal to snow machine in Anchorage, and there were some good trails to ride on a little north of my house. We took off probably at around 11 p.m., rode up and around a quarter mile, and cut off on the trails. It had snowed about 10 inches a few days before, so there was fresh snow, with no tracks. I was leading the way for about a half an hour, and then we stopped and talked for a little bit. We took off again and kept cruising on some sort of game trail that led to an opening in the woods. I rode off into the openings with my friends, following about 50 yards behind me. I came over this little mound and saw strange tracks leading to this spot in the snow, where it looked like something had pushed aside some snow and laid down. I figured it was just a moose or something. But I followed the tracks over the next small hill, and as I came down the far side, my headlight pointed right at the back of a Bigfoot. It was only about 10 to 12 feet in front of me. It was running in the opposite direction. I slammed on the brakes because I was scared out of my mind. It continued to run away, jumped over a dead log covered in snow, and disappeared into a group of trees into the darkness. I was so surprised and scared, I quickly turned around and rode back towards my friends. I met them back by the first mound and said, "We need to get out of here," and rode back towards my house. When I told them about it back near my house, they laughed and told me it was probably a bear or somebody in the woods. But I was 100% positive that this was not a bear or anything else. The way it was running through the deep snow made me sure that it wasn't anything human. For a long time, I was made fun of, and everyone told me I was crazy, so I don't like talking about it. It was the month of July, 2009, in Fairbanks, Alaska. I was heading south on Auburn Drive towards Farmer's Loop, which was about a mile away. It was a wooded area, frequented by homes, and in general, would be considered a populated area. Houses are on average about 100 to 200 feet apart, with only the general area around the close to the homes cleared out. Most of the area by far is wooded. It was the section of road where it passes by Pearl Creek Elementary School. The school can be seen through the woods. Some of the woods in the area are quite thick and in some places can't be seen into more than about 10 or 15 feet. But in this area, it had apparently been cleaned out quite a bit, and sight lines into the sections of the siding were very open. The school and vegetable garden could be seen off to the right from the road I was on. It was about 6 p.m., and I was heading home after a day of working on a deck that I was building. The weather was clear with the sun high in the sky. As I was driving, I happened to notice a man standing by the right side of the road, about 100 yards ahead. It was more of an unconscious recognition. There's nothing unusual about a man standing on the side of the road in this area. As I got within about 50 yards, I looked closer. "That's no man," I said to myself. Shortly after that, 1 or 2 seconds, he bolts into the woods toward the school. He did it like a wild animal would do, if spooked. I didn't slow down until I got to the place where I saw him go to the woods, which is where I stopped. I could see him running away from the road, and when he was into the woods about 30 or so yards, he turned left and was now running parallel to the road in the same direction I was heading. I got a good look at him, but not his face. I could have probably seen his face had I not been so mesmerized and had the presence of mind to look at it. I was busy noticing other things. His fur or hair looked to be about 3 to 4 inches all over the main part of his body. It was a reddish, rusty color. I was mildly struck by how red it was, but it definitely had some rustiness to it. He was about 6 feet tall and looked to weigh around 200 pounds. He ran with a strange, hoppy kind of run. It wasn't a limp. With one foot he pushed off with was more than a normal running move, but the other foot he pushed off with propelled him upward, about a foot or less, and forward. I watched him until he disappeared into the woods. There was a road about 100 yards ahead, and I took off to get it so I could turn right, and in 20 yards turn right again to the road that led to the school parking lot. The wooded area he was in was sort of a peninsula, and he seemingly had to be in there somewhere. The woods I was looking into from that angle were quite thick, and I didn't see him and haven't seen him since. A little farther up on the right was the school garden that had people in it, around 7 to 10, which I'm now sorry I didn't stop to go and talk to them about it. The next day, I was driving into work on the deck. I naturally slowed down in the area, and I saw him, stopped actually, and was surveying the area when a couple walking their dogs were approaching. I flagged them down and told the story of what happened the evening before, and they told me that about a week ago, they were there with their dogs and they were on their way to the other side of the school property, by the soccer field, and 3 kids came running over to them saying, "Did you see Sasquatch?" They also said that what appeared to be as a dad was with them who didn't seem excited about it. My conclusion of whether it was real or not is summed up to me saying, it was either real or there was a man in a very, very convincing costume. I reported it to the Fish and Game office in Fairbanks a couple of days later. The person who was taking the report was sort of rolling his eyes through the whole thing as he seemed to be writing it down on a piece of scrap paper. I even had to ask him to take my phone number just in case. I personally did not see it, but a non-commissioned officer I work with, along with his wife, child, and hunting buddy, were on their way home when, according to them, a large, hairy, about 7-foot-tall ape-looking thing crossed the road in front of them. From what I could gather, none of them are familiar with Bigfoot information. Anyway, they say it crossed the road, which is about 35 feet in width, in 4 to 5 steps. It seemed, and disappeared into the brush on the other side, which leads to a river called the Chenna. Both of the guys have been hunting since childhood, and are sure they know a bear when they see one. The thing crossed the road on its hind legs, and as we all agreed, yeah, a bear can raise up on its hind legs, and even take a few clumsy steps. But cross a 35-foot road? No way. They say they even came back later, and looked for tracks. He wasn't too sure, but he says he found some tracks that didn't look like any tracks he was familiar with. They were pointed inwards as a person who is what I call pigeon-toed. They heard or saw nothing else but were a bit shook and headed home. The entire story seemed incredible to me because the incident took place on a military installation. I really don't want to get the guys involved because they fear ridicule. This happened in late August of '97 in a side valley of Goldstream Valley, a relatively populated area just north of Fairbanks. Although it's quite close to the Fairbanks area, and there are many houses and roads in the main part of Goldstream, the side valleys are still as wild as they were 1,000 years ago. I was hunting ruffed grouse in one of these side valleys. I prefer not to say which one. I was on a south-facing aspen-covered hillside and had hunted all afternoon and evening, intending to spend the night out on the hill and hunt my way back in the morning. As I was making camp, a black bear almost walked right into me. I heard him coming from a ways off and scared him away before he got closer. Later on, it will become apparent why I mention this. So I was sleeping out in the open, no tent, under a spruce tree. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by something prowling around my camp, maybe 30 feet or so away from me, walking in a circle. I mentioned the bear before, and this was not a bear I heard in the night. My father is a hunting guide, and I literally grew up hunting bears. I know what a bear sounds like when it's walking. Whatever this thing was, it was walking on 2 legs, with a bit of a shuffling sound between each step, like it was dragging its feet just a bit. The leaves on the forest floor were dried like potato chips, and it was breaking a lot of branches. I could hear it and follow its movements quite distinctly. I have to say that I've spent a lot of time here in the Alaskan bush, and have never before or since been truly afraid of anything I've encountered. But I don't mind saying on that particular night, I was literally shaking with fear. It, for whatever it was, circled my camp for what seemed like hours, but it was probably only 5 or so minutes. Finally, remembering something I once read about Indians' beliefs regarding woodsmen, I started talking to it, albeit in a shaky voice, saying I wanted no trouble that night. The thing stopped dead in its tracks, and then a few moments later, I heard it trotting downhill, away from me. Talking to such a creature may sound kinda cornball, but all I know is that it worked. I've kicked myself for this many times since, but the next morning, I didn't bother to look for any tracks, hair, evidence, etc. I just packed up and resumed my hunting. I had no further trouble with the woodsman. As a final couple of notes, I do recall hearing kind of a low muttering sound as it was prowling around. Also, having since done some reading on Bigfoot sightings, I've noticed that a lot of people reported the animal having a strong, foul odor. However, I did not smell any particular odor, foul or otherwise. Most of the native peoples of Alaska seem to have stories about the woodsman or the bushman or even the hairy man. Other than this, I've never heard of anyone I know having an actual encounter with a woodsman in Alaska. I was part of a group of about a dozen Army personnel training in the area. It was over summer on a warm, clear day, and this was around the Black Rapids Glacier, Alaska-Richardson Highway south of Delta Junction. We were about tree line and had been camped there for several days. I was looking across the nearest valley when I spotted movement. It was on the base of a steep mountainside in bare, rocky terrain, with snow fields descending down the small gullies on the hillside. It was moving up the valley about a half a mile away. When it crossed the snow, you could plainly see that this was not a bear. It walked upright with long strides and arms swinging and moved fast across the white snow. It was dark in color, like a bear. I have seen bears many times since in the same type of terrain, and they do not move like this did. It was too big and too fast to be a human. Bears can and do walk upright, but usually only for short distances when they need to see or smell something and need the height. They don't travel in this manner, and not in this difficult of terrain. I pointed it out to the other guys, and we watched it until you could no longer see it. When it was out of the snow, it was hard to see against the rocks. We wanted to go look at the tracks, but everybody was scared to go down there. We had to sleep there that night, and nobody would go outside after dark. The next day, we got out and never went back. 20 years later, I still would not go up there, even with a group and with guns. The only thing I have seen that looked like this is the descriptions of Bigfoot. I was telling a friend about this, and he said he found tracks in the sand in Alaska, out by king salmon. He said they were over 2 feet long, but looked human. He has a lot of outdoor experience here and says they were in no way the tracks of a bear. This was also in a remote area where you don't see other people, only planes. Something that I would not believe unless I saw it just stepped up about 30 feet in front of me, stared at me, and kind of grunted and walked into the woods real quiet. I did have a rifle and a handgun on me because I was out hunting, but for some reason I did not feel threatened. Although I did turn around and head back to my car often, glancing over my shoulder. I did hear some cracking branches on several occasions, and I heard a few low to high tones coming from the direction that the really tall thing, at least 6 feet, and shaggy dark brown thing went down, and made me want to walk a little faster. That was some of those sounds that were answered from the other side of the road. Other than that, though, no further sighting or hearing took place over the year. I should mention that this also occurred back in 1964, and I have not been able to put it out of my mind. It occurred on a small dirt road which was about 35 miles south of Fairbanks. This dirt road was directly off the Richardson Highway. Heading south, you take a left off the highway, and this road led to an old camp near a small pond which was about 2 miles in. This is just a report from a native that said he saw a hairy person about 6 to 7 feet tall, all hair, casually walking across the dirt road by Skylac Lake. This specifically was Skylac Lake Road by Skylac Lake Road in Kenai Peninsula, off of the main highway back in the woods. This thing looked at him and stopped on the road and appeared surprised. Then it took off into the woods swiftly. He said it was very agile and quick. He was about 300 yards away from it. There was no snow on the ground yet. He said they looked at each other for a bit, and he loaded his single-shot shotgun, because he didn't know if it was friendly or not. He was going to run and tell the authorities, but he didn't say anything, and he didn't think anything or anyone would believe him. He was very serious as he was telling the story. I know the man. He is a very strong Christian. That was probably around late October or early November. This place is near Sterling, Alaska. The location is full of spruce forest. I've been there. It's secluded from the main highway and full of forest and lakes and mountains. This sighting goes back to the fall of 1992. A friend and I were driving back to Fairbanks from Anchorage. I was driving her truck, a 1980 Dodge D50. These trucks sit very low to the ground, and it was late at night, and we were just about to the tourist area of the Denali Park. It wasn't winter yet. Just before a corner, my lights hit something sitting on the yellow line in the middle of the road. The lights to this truck were grossly out of adjustment, so they were pointing right at the thing. It was sitting in the middle of the road with its legs pulled up to its chest and its arms folded over its knees. Its head was between its arms, looking toward the ground. It had long, human-like hair. At first, I thought it was an orangutan, but then I thought to myself, what would orangutan be doing in the middle of nowhere in Alaska? I've lived here almost all of my life, and there is no animal like this. I thought to myself the only way that could have been an orangutan if there's a circus out here, and I knew that was not a possibility in such a remote area. I drove right next to it, and I was at its level. If I had been going slow, I could have touched it easily. I was freaked out and thought I must be seeing things. Maybe I was tired. My friends saw it too. Although neither one of us said a word until we reached the gas station in the town of Healy, just past Denali. She said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "I thought I was seeing things." This spooked us so bad we didn't even say anything to each other about it until we were around other people. We have talked about this and still agree that we saw this thing. We were about to give up on trying to explain it to anyone else because no one believes us. We both have decided not to bring it up because no one believes it anyway. Why I feel this is so unusual is there's no animal native to Alaska that could resemble this thing in any way. We have bears, moose, caribou, porcupine, rabbits, etc. But none of these animals have knees or long reddish-colored hair. I don't know how to explain it, and I've given up trying because nobody believes it. They just think you're joking. I don't want to be harassed by any nuts. I just want to be able to share my genuine incident in case others have seen what I have. I was going for a drive back in the spring of 1995. I had 3 kids with me, my daughters and one of their cousins. It was starting to get dark, and I decided I wanted to turn around and not go all the way down this sort of yard. So I pulled into a turnaround. I had the car lights on, just in the bushes on the other side of the road though. I noticed some movement. I thought it might have been a deer, so I stopped the car entirely. The first thing I really saw was really bright blue eyes. Then I noticed how far up they were. The thing had to be about 8 to 9 feet tall. The rest of this thing was really dark. It might have been black or dark brown. My daughters saw the feet. They were huge. When I realized it might be a Bigfoot, I freaked out and tore out of there. I've never been down there after dark again. I rarely go there at all. It didn't move after the initial movement we saw. It just stood there looking at us. There are local legends about a wild man in the woods, and recently there have been a rash of sighting. Some of them are pretty close to town. The people who claim to have seen it are pretty believable, and their stories are quite convincing. I and my cousin were walking down Harris River from the Harris River campground. We were walking about 30 to 45 minutes when my cousin thought he saw something standing out in front of us about 100 or so feet away. When he asked me if I could see what it was, I told him I couldn't see because I don't have any contacts on or glasses. So he told me it was just a stump, and I was like, okay. Then we went over to where we thought the thing was, and in the sand about 1 inch deep, there was a footprint like a man's. In the shoe size, it looked like it might have been around the size 15. There were 3 footprints, and about a minute later, we ran for about 10 minutes and we started walking, and then we got to the road. About a mile away from the picnic area, where we were having a Mother's Day picnic, we started to race each other to the picnic area where our family members were. We told them about it, and we just kept it to ourselves for some odd reason. This incident happened around 11 p.m. at night. My daughter was home alone. She lives with a relative who was out of town. She calls me at 11:22. She was terrified. She said she could hear something walking back and forth by her bedroom window. She also said she looked out the window, and when she first heard it and saw something big and black, really big, she described the thing to have been about 3 to 4 feet above the bottom of the window. When I went down to look behind the house this morning, I stood by the window. I am 5'4", and my eyes just reached the bottom of the window, so I figure this thing must have been 7 to 8 feet tall. We live in a small village of less than 500 people. There are a lot of bushes and trees in between the houses. Their house is close to the beach, and there's forests surrounding the town. Now, I've never known my daughter to be afraid of anything, but last night when I went to pick her up, she was shaking like a leaf. She was hysterical. It took me almost an hour to calm her down. I questioned her about what happened. She called me about 5 minutes after she first saw it. She was too scared to move. When I got down there, I would not look behind the house, but she was hiding in my relative's closet. She said it was walking back and forth right behind the house. She described the footsteps as a sound that someone very large walking on 2 feet, kind of like a stomping. My daughter is very down to earth, not one prone to dramatics. When I first went down there, I didn't really know what was going on, just that my daughter was scared spitless, but I would not look behind the house. When I went up to the house, my hair felt like it was standing on end, and I had goosebumps really bad. I was scared and I didn't know why. There are quite a few other stories about sightings close to town. One was less than a mile away, but there have also been other sightings on a nearby road by several people. In fact, there's probably too many for me to tell about.